I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed, Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I am chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPV approaches. The Nuclear Energy Modernization, Innovation and Modernization Act explicitly recognizes the role of RIPV approaches. There is a lot of guidance available on RIPV approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPV concepts and methods. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPV to enable practitioners of these methods to share their knowledge and experience. We have scheduled these webinars for the last Friday of every month, and past presentations are available on the ANS website. Today's presentation is going to be delivered by Rani Franovich of the Breakthrough Institute. Rani is a member of RP3C, and she previously worked at the NRC as I too did. And I'd like to welcome Rani to this community of practice event. Thank you, Rani, you're on.
Thank you, Prasad. It's a pleasure to be with you for another community of practice. I am Rani Franovich, a senior policy advisor for nuclear energy innovation at the Breakthrough Institute. Before joining the Breakthrough Institute, as Prasad mentioned, I spent 30 years with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the public's interest in the deployment of new and advanced reactors. Now, much of this presentation is actually borrowed from a presentation I made to the NRC on July 28, 2022, to reach alignment on what is actually meant by the terms technology inclusive, risk-informed, and performance-based. I also presented some of this information during a July 29, 2022 RP3C Community of Practice entitled A Performance-Based Approach for 10 CFR Part 53, and Prasad and I collaborated on that presentation. Today I'll be discussing the role and responsibility of the NRC in serving the public's interest by developing a decision-making process for licensing new and advanced reactors that is risk-informed, performance-based, and technology-inclusive as mandated by Congress and the NEMA Act that Prasad has mentioned. Slide 2, please. As a preliminary matter, the Breakthrough Institute is an independent 501c3 global research center that identifies and promotes technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. As such, we represent public interests. We advocate for appropriate regulation, licensing, and oversight of advanced nuclear reactors to enable the timely deployment of safe, innovative, and economically viable emerging nuclear technologies. We believe new and advanced reactors represent a critical pathway to climate mitigation and deep decarbonization. The Breakthrough Institute receives no funding from industry. Slide 3, please. In early July of this year, the Breakthrough Institute released a report entitled Advancing Nuclear Energy, Evaluating Deployment, Investment, and Impact in America's Clean Energy Future. The report uses a high-resolution nationwide model of the United States electricity sector to demonstrate how advanced nuclear reactors might play a major role in a least cost plan to transition the power grid entirely to clean energy sources by 2050, assuming that the first advanced reactors are available for deployment by 2030. The report further shows that advanced nuclear reactors efficiently complement other clean energy technologies like wind and solar power and balance variations in generation over time to reliably meet U.S. electricity demand. The flexibility offered by advanced nuclear power can produce long-term cost savings as the nation transforms to clean energy. A transformational licensing pathway that eliminates unnecessary requirements and undue regulatory burden will enable the safe, efficient, and rapid deployment of advanced nuclear energy. The NRC's successful development of a novel licensing process is in the public's interest because the risks of many baseload alternatives to nuclear power emit CO2, harm human health, and undermine national energy security. Slide 4, please. As Prasad mentioned, the NRC is mandated by congressional acts such as NEMA, but even before NEMA, the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974 requires the NRC to, quote, make the nation self-sufficient in energy to advance the goals restoring, protecting, and enhancing environmental quality and to assure public health and safety. That comes from Section 2 of the Energy Reorganization Act Declaration of Purpose. The NEMA Act of 2019 that Prasad mentioned, the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, calls for a flexible and practicable framework for licensing a variety of reactor technologies, including, where appropriate, the use of risk-informed and performance-based techniques and other tools and methods. Next slide, please. The Breakthrough Institute is among a majority of stakeholders who believe additional work is needed for Part 53 to satisfy NEMA. Specifically, the rule must be risk-informed and performance-based to the extent possible. To be usable, Part 53 also must be flexible and practicable. The success of Part 53 is important because nuclear energy improves the general public welfare, enabling both innovation and commercialization of advanced nuclear reactors enables society to realize the benefits of the next generation of clean nuclear power. The key to Part 53's success lies in its potential to establish high-level safety goals, which will allow greater flexibility for a wide range of diverse and emerging technologies. That potential depends on how the NRC resolves concerns raised since the NRC staff developed and unveiled its proposals for the Part 53 rule. Next slide, please. This slide features a center diagram attributed to my former colleague at the NRC, Bill Reckley, whom I believe is actually joining us this Friday for the COP, and I'm glad he's here. I've modified this diagram to depict continuums along two spectrums of regulatory approaches. One involves risk and ranges from deterministic to risk-informed to risk-based. The other is less continuous and represents an either prescriptive or performance-based approach. A performance-based regulation identifies prescriptive safety objectives at a high level in an objectives hierarchy. A gold standard probabilistic risk assessment, or PRA, is not the only way to risk-inform a regulation. Risk is commonly defined as a situation involving exposure to danger. A risk-informed regulation can be informed by qualitative assessments of danger, consistent with this definition. Sound judgments about realistic risk can be made without PRA tools. Importantly, Part 53 in its current form is represented by the dark gray arrows pointing west, deterministic, north, prescriptive, and east, risk-based. The green zone illustrates an optimized balance of a risk-informed and performance-based regulation. This optimization can still be achieved if NRC staff is open to streamlining the proposed Part 53 rule. On July 21st, 2022, NRC Chair Hansen expressed his own reservations that the anticipated 1,000-page proposed rule package will be attractive to developers or responsive to NEMA. We share his reservations. The volume of any regulation generally is commensurate with its level of prescriptiveness. The prescriptive, deterministic, and risk-based attributes of the rule stand in the way of success. Specifically, Framework A is heavily reliant on a formal PRA, making it almost risk-based. Additionally, Frameworks A and B do not sufficiently feature the elements of a performance-based approach as defined in the Staff Requirements Memorandum for SECI 1998-144. For example, neither framework affords developers or applicants sufficient flexibility to determine how to meet established performance criteria in ways that will encourage and reward improved outcomes. Framework B similarly relies on a formal PRA unless the applicant can demonstrate by applying a set of overly conservative, deterministic, and prescriptive criteria that a PRA is not needed to inform a licensing decision with reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety. Next slide, please. The figure in this slide was borrowed from a February 28, 2020 webinar on risk-informed performance-based practices presented by Kent Welter of NewScale Power. A link to the webinar is provided at the bottom of the slide. Now, this slide represents a typical performance-based structure that manages regulatory requirements by using safety margins. Larger safety margins afford greater operational flexibility. The top safety objective is the mission. For NRC's purposes, the mission is to enable safe civilian use of nuclear energy. Level 1 objectives define what is necessary and sufficient, and this is an important distinction. What is necessary and sufficient to achieve the mission. Level 2 objectives define the success or outcome objectives that will ensure Level 1 objectives are met and thereby the mission is accomplished. Next slide, please. This slide presents a conceptual risk-informed performance-based approach to Part 53. A transition from high-level prescriptive requirements to a set of performance-based requirements is shown between the Level 1 and Level 2 performance objectives. Again, Level 1 objectives prescribe what is necessary and sufficient for applicants to include in their submittals and NRC to review and justify a licensing decision or safety finding, again, with reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety. The Part 53 paragraph 200 series are generally at the Level 2 performance objectives in this performance-based requirements management structure. This area of transition is the focus of critical stakeholder interest in Part 53. Next slide, please. This slide depicts a risk-informed, performance-based decision-making process for the reactor oversight process, or the ROP. In this context, the decision involves determining what level of inspection and oversight is necessary and sufficient to ensure adequate safety performance at any currently operating nuclear power plant. Here, the objectives hierarchy follows the pyramid structure presented in the last two slides, and the hierarchy includes fundamental objectives and subordinate means objectives. Implied in this structure is that the mission is assured if level 1 objectives are met, and level 1 objectives are met if level 2 outcome objectives are met, as demonstrated through NRC inspection and licensee reporting of performance indicator data, which I will discuss in greater detail when I get to slide 11. In this slide, the ROP cornerstone of mitigation systems is highlighted in lavender to illustrate second-level performance outcome objectives that, with respect to Part 53, fall within the area of transition and may be more appropriately described in regulatory guidance. And I will discuss this further in a few minutes, but before I move on, I would like to briefly describe the ROP's predecessor, the Systematic Assessment of Licensee Performance, or SALP, enforced verbatim compliance with regulatory requirements, irrespective of any safety benefit. In the late 1990s, Congress threatened deep cuts to the NRC's budget if it did not change its oversight of operating plants. Back then, NRC offered its own concept, and the industry offered something fundamentally different. The NRC staff conducted a workshop, I believe it was a 4-day workshop, to agree in concept with external stakeholders to a new oversight regime. The end result was truly transformational and largely based on the industry's proposed concept. In 2000, the risk-informed, performance-based ROP was first implemented to focus licensee and NRC staff resources on those things most important to safety performance, even performance not covered by regulation, but deemed important to safety. The ROP represents a complete paradigm shift from using enforcement to ensure regulatory compliance to now performing structured assessments of each plant's safety performance and applying an appropriate level of inspection commensurate with that performance. During a commission briefing on July 21st, 2022, Dr. Ed Lyman of the Union of Concerned Scientists stated that the industry wants less in the Part 53 rule and more in guidance because inspection findings and enforcement actions are limited to what is in the rule. This assertion is not supported by Commission policy governing the ROP. And as an NRC inspector in the field when the ROP was implemented in 2000, and an NRC supervisor of ROP program managers for 6 years, I consider myself a subject matter expert in this area. Under the ROP, licensees are accountable to guidance and standards they claim to follow. Failure to comply with regulations or to conform with self-imposed standards in guidance or in plant procedures can result and does result in performance deficiencies and inspection findings. These inspection findings must be addressed in plant corrective action programs, irrespective of whether they involve non-compliance with regulatory requirements. This feature of the ROP is what makes it performance-based as opposed to compliance-based. By contrast, the Systematic Assessment of Licensee Performance, the SALP predecessor to the ROP, focused NRC and licensee resources on the enforcement of prescriptive and deterministic regulatory requirements, even if compliance imposed regulatory burden without a commensurate improvement in plant safety performance. Next slide, please. This slide portrays a level 2 means objective under the ROP, again using the mitigation systems cornerstone as an example. The level 2 objective is to demonstrate adequate performance of mitigation systems. A combination of lower level design features and programmatic controls, beginning with safety functions at the top and management at the bottom, is necessary to achieve this level 2 objective. These lower level performance attributes under the cornerstone include operational programs that NRC proposes to codify in Part 53. Many stakeholders object to this prescriptive level of regulation. Next slide, please. As I mentioned when discussing slide 9, the ROP applies a risk-informed, performance-based approach to regulatory decision. Again, for the ROP, the decision involves determining what level of inspection and oversight is necessary and sufficient to ensure adequate safety performance at any currently operating nuclear power plant. This slide features Exhibit 1 from NRC's Inspection Manual Chapter 0308, the Reactor Oversight Process Basis document. The figure depicts the ROP decision-making process based on inspection findings from the NRC's inspection program, including reactive inspections, supplemental inspections, and the baseline inspection program. The safety significance of inspection findings is characterized using the significance determination process, which applies risk insights using quantitative methods and qualitative considerations. Characterizing safety significance of an inspection finding is a deliberative process and was never intended to be based solely on PRA and core damage frequencies or large early release frequencies. Another performance-based consideration for ROP decision-making is performance indicator data that are voluntarily submitted to the NRC at periodic intervals. Performance indicators are submitted by licensees who are operating the nuclear power plants, and inspection findings. Both of these inputs are used to determine which column of the ROP action matrix a plant falls under. The action matrix then assigns a level of oversight and inspection appropriate for each plant's safety performance. Next slide, please. So this diagram has been used before in this presentation. I'm just showing it again here. It depicts the objectives hierarchy of a performance-based decision-making structure for the ROP. Next slide. This slide represents the same objectives hierarchy used for the ROP and follows the same requirements management pyramid structure presented in slides 7 and 8. Again, level 1 objectives should be prescribed in Part 53 to establish what is necessary and sufficient for applicants to include in their submittals, and for NRC to review and justify a licensing decision or safety finding with reasonable assurance of adequate protection. Level 2 outcome objectives may also warrant prescription in the rule. Beneath level 2, operational programs are depicted. These programs encompass a wide range of facility operations. Performance attributes for operational programs are important, and they provide clarity, stability, and predictability. However, these attributes can and should be described in NRC guidance documents to afford greater flexibility for a wide range of nuclear reactor applicants. As I have mentioned, many stakeholders object to the prescriptive requirements for operational programs currently in the proposed rule. During a commission briefing on July 21st, 2022, NRC staff leadership asserted that clarity can be achieved only through regulations. External stakeholders have expressed disagreement with this view. For example, frameworks A and B could represent acceptable methods and be relocated to guidance documents as optional approaches. Unlike rules, guidance documents can be updated and enhanced as needed over time and as informed by operating experience and lessons learned. By contrast, changes to regulations involve a laborious multi-year process. Next slide, please. Part 53 should require applicants to describe operational programs that emphasize and reinforce industry best practices. An appropriate level of detail for each program may vary depending on the reactor design. This slide lists a number of operational programs that may apply to new and advanced reactor designs. To name a few: quality management, human performance, safety-conscious work environment, problem identification and resolution, ALARA, or as low as reasonably achievable radiation management, and operator training and qualification. Fire protection programs are not included in this list, but they represent yet another example. Part 53 requirements related to fire protection have received critical stakeholder feedback. However, the fire protection program is just an example of codification of operational programs. There are many others, including in-service inspection and emergency preparedness. Prescriptive and deterministic requirements for operational programs, in broad terms, decrease applicant flexibility and increase regulatory burden. During a public meeting on July 28, 2022, NRC leadership indicated they are amenable to relocating programmatic controls to regulatory guidance. That would be a positive step. More collaboration with stakeholders and engagement in an open manner would help the NRC establish where the rules should govern and where guidance is more appropriate. Next slide, please. In closing, I leave you with a few thoughts. NRC has articulated a position in a public meeting that regulations are flexible, the existing regulations, because exemptions can always be requested. However, this does not afford the flexibility intended by NEMA. The new Part 53 rule is intended to minimize the need for exemptions from regulatory requirements because exemptions are burdensome and costly. Risk information should be applied to focus rule language and regulatory requirements on those things most important to safety. It is not clear that the NRC staff's approach is sufficiently risk-informed in practical terms that would minimize the need for onerous exemption requests, NRC staff reviews, and NRC staff approvals. The preliminary rule can be simplified to focus on safety performance in a structured objectives hierarchy that retains high-level performance goals in the rule and relocates prescriptive criteria for how those goals are accomplished in guidance. For Part 53 to be successful, it must be durable in the decades to come. A durable regulation must be sufficiently performance-based to accommodate a wide range of emerging and future technologies, even those that have yet to be conceived. So Prasad, with that, I thank you for this opportunity to present on behalf of the Breakthrough Institute, and I am happy to answer any questions that Pat may see in the chat.
Sure. We do have a whole bunch of comments as well that I think were just inserted just to be part of the discussion. I think the first question really is just clarifying the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974, which I think might have been answered by a few others, but if you might be able just to confirm, Rani?
Is the question about what the act says?
Yes.
No, this is Jim
Nope.
August. When you brought it up, Ronnie, it was to support a point you had made. And at that point in time, I was trying to think, how does the Energy Reorganization Act specifically tell the NRC how to behave? And I mean, it was some of the goals for what the NRC was chartered to do that I would have guessed, if you hadn't mentioned that act, I would have guessed it would have come through in one of the later acts, much later, like the 1995 Act or the 2018 Act or something. So anyhow, if you don't remember, that's fine.
Actually, I do remember. And I appreciate the question, Jim, because, you know, I worked on Project AIM around 2015, 2016, 2017 at the NRC, which was an internal initiative to kind of change the NRC's culture to be a modern risk-informed regulator. And under Project AIM, the NRC leadership actually used not just the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974, but even the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to remind NRC of its legal mandate, which is to essentially ensure safe civilian use and enable safe civilian use of nuclear materials, including nuclear energy. And so on slide 4, what I was saying was an exact quote from the Energy Reorganization Act to remind the NRC that its mandate is to, quote, make the nation self-sufficient in energy to advance the goals of restoring, protecting, and enhancing environmental quality, and to assure public health and safety. That's directly out of the Energy Reorganization Act. Surprisingly, the Atomic Energy Act includes similar language. I don't have it in front of me now, but if you were to Google it and pull it up, you would find very similar language in the 1954 Act. So I hope that answers your question, Jim, and if it doesn't, let me know.
Well, it does, Rani, but let me just take that one step further. In your closing thoughts, you talk about the preliminary rule can be simplified. And I mean, I love that idea, but it's like the problem the NRC has is that they have to have some kind of rule to, you know, be the NRC and do enforcement. And if you remove all prescriptive criteria, what do they do, right? I mean, legally, can they do anything? So that's my last comment because I want others to speak.
Yep, and I've heard similar comments before, and so I'm just going to use the ROP as an example again, where guidance, if an applicant or a licensee, in the case of the ROP, if they claim that they will follow guidance on how to meet a high-level objective in Part 53, then that is what they are accountable to. And the beauty and the elegance of putting this kind of prescriptive, how you can achieve the objectives of a rule, is particularly elegant because as we learn more about these new technologies when they are commissioned and operated over a number of years, we don't have to incorporate lessons learned and operating experience in a rule revision. We update the guidance. And as applicants and developers pursue some of the approaches to meeting the high-level objectives and the NRC finds them to be acceptable, that can be preserved in guidance as an acceptable method. And so in my view, having a very high-level rule makes sense. There needs to be some level of prescriptiveness. And if I could ask Pat to take us back to, I believe it's slide 7, Pat. Let's go to maybe 12. Here we go. Up one.
11.
Yes, up one more. Okay. I believe that a rule that is written to cover reactor safety, radiation safety, and safeguards, that those are the objectives that must be met. We have to maintain reactor safety, radiation safety, and safeguards. And then some level 2 criteria or outcome objectives involving initiating events, mitigation systems, barrier integrity, emergency preparedness, public and occupational safety, and physical protection would be the level 2 objectives that must be assured. But the how should not be codified in the rule if it's going to be a performance-based approach. An applicant or licensee or developer, probably more of an applicant, could offer a method for how it plans to meet the high level and lower level, but still high level 2 outcome objectives. And the NRC, instead of using the checklist that has been used for decades, would think about, would this suffice? Is this safe enough? And use some engineering judgment, which it has the broad latitude to use. That would accommodate a much wider variety of developers and applicants, in my view.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. Jim actually did submit a couple other comments or questions, and I'm really not sure, Jim, you submitted a comment, not performance-based specifics, question mark. Might you be able to elaborate?
Yeah, well, I think Rani just sort of explained it, and you know, I think it's really a great presentation, and I follow what I heard you say, Rani, is let the licensee or the licensee applicant propose what the framework will be, and that makes perfect sense to me. So you know, maybe that's the solution, but someone still has to enforce the licensee's compliance with their own rules then.
Yes.
Right?
And that is the beauty of the ROP. If they say, we're going to follow such and such guidance, or we have such and such procedures governing our operational programs, they are accountable to following those procedures, even if they aren't requirements. And so it really drives safety performance rather than compliance with prescriptive and deterministic criteria. And so, yeah, an applicant should be able to offer, here's how we plan to meet these level 1 and level 2 objectives. And the NRC would need to think about it and couldn't just use a standard review plan to say it meets it or it doesn't and check it off. It's going to require the NRC to actually think about whether or not this is sufficient for reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety.
So, Pat, I think there were 2 questions from Sven Bader. Perhaps, Rani, you can move to those.
Sure. He asked if there's any chance that you could potentially describe why reactor regulations in other countries like the UK are considered less burdensome than the NRC's regulations. Is the international regulatory community more effectively using RIPB?
I love this question. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily have the answer, but I have some thoughts on this. And I was asked earlier this week, or maybe just yesterday, whether or not the NRC has benchmarked against other international regulatory bodies on how they approach the licensing of new and advanced reactors. And I don't know if the NRC has. I do know that the NRC's oversight process is considered kind of a gold standard approach to monitoring and responding to operating plant performance. And so that is kind of a flagship program that the NRC has, that the international community has largely borrowed from or copied outright. But when it comes to licensing processes, the commission policies and directions from the late 1990s have never really been implemented, with a few exceptions like the maintenance rule, in our licensing programs. And I don't know if I don't know if the international community is better at this or not. I've heard that they are. And I certainly don't know if the NRC has benchmarked with them, but I think it would be a great idea to do that. And I've heard that the UK in particular is very effective in licensing new reactors with a performance-based, risk-informed kind of an approach. So thank you for the questions, Ben. I hope that answers it to the extent that I can.
And here's his follow-up then. He asked if you are suggesting the rule be written in a simple and generic method using RIPB and then reactor type specific SRPs be provided.
That makes sense to me. And SRPs can be updated without a rule change, without that laborious multi-year process. And standard review plans can be used to preserve decision-making by the regulator on a new approach, a new technology that is then made available to other stakeholders, other applicants for use as an acceptable method for meeting a high-level regulatory requirement. Yes, I think that is a very good suggestion.
I think the rest are really more comments that we have from Greg Hudson. He just said that it sounds like the safety case approach used in other industries. And then from Sven, he did say that the gold standard, Gold Coast to operators and reactor designers. And then Jim August commented that he thinks the UK represents an outlier approach compared with everyone else, at least that's his personal opinion. I don't know if we want to take just some off the cuff comments or questions.
Well, Pat, let me add one thing to my very final comment there. Since we have a representative of the NRC, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I am interested in your opinion on whether you think the UK approach, which is radically different from, I think, anyone else in the world, whether that would fly at all in the United States, because it is very different.
Jim, are you calling on our colleague, Bill Reckley?
Well, I was inviting him to speak, but I don't want to put him on the spot either, and he might not be able to. So, you know, I mean, he can't, maybe he can't share personal opinion. I don't know. Well, we do have a couple of NRC retirees.
Yeah, when I'm here, I can express my opinion. I won't do an agency opinion. Yeah, the UK safety case approach is different and offers certain advantages. It also offers certain disadvantages. And you know, one analogy is you bring me a rock until I, the regulator, tell you've brought me enough rocks. And so the predictability of that approach is sometimes questioned. If you want to look at the outcome, I would say there's enough reactors both in the UK and in the US and elsewhere to look at what might be the best regulatory models. I think you might want to look actually outside of either Europe or the United States if you want to find one that's been most effective recently.
Perhaps Russia or China?
Well, I was going to say, can you
say
more?
I probably would not say Russia or China, although they've been successful in deployment. I was thinking more of the
UAE?
in the Mideast. Yes, thank you. Yes. Which, by the way, borrowed heavily from the NRC's regulatory approach. They probably just it was a recent test, and I think most people would say was pretty effective.
Well, now, Bill, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what do you think the most significant attributes of their particular approach is that makes them more effective? I mean, given that they've used an awful lot of our material.
Well, I think you have to look at it in combination. The vendor, the builder, the regulator, and all of those things contribute, right? And you know this probably better than I. And it was just how the whole system fit together that worked in that particular case. And it did have some advantages in that design had been looked at and developed over a long period of time. There was not a it was an evolutionary design, but it was not brand new, and it was one that actually even the NRC had looked at in design certification space. So,
And that's the System 80 design?
yeah, or at least a derivation of it. Yeah.
Yeah, the Korean version of the System 80 Plus or
Right.
something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
That's right.
Cool.
I see a question from Jim asking if I could restate the UCS position more bluntly. So unless there are other things that are more important, I'd like to just touch that real quickly. What Dr. Lyman asserted was that in stakeholder meetings, industry and federal partners have expressed concern with the volume of regulation that's in Part 53 and the daunting nature of kind of navigating one's way through all of that regulatory language. And several many stakeholders have actually suggested that that level of detail be provided in a standard review plan, for example, or guidance. And Dr. Lyman made the assertion that the reason that industry wants less in the rule and more in a standard review plan or any other guidance is because then the NRC can't hold a licensee accountable to meeting the guidance when the plant is operational, that all the NRC can do is enforce regulatory requirements through or compliance with regulatory requirements through enforcement actions, and that inspection findings have to be based on regulatory requirements, and it's just not the case. Commission policy for the reactor oversight process specifically states that a self-imposed expectation or requirement, meaning if you commit to following a certain standard, or if you have station procedures that govern how you conduct plant operations, or how you maintain the plant, how you conduct your surveillance tests, then you're accountable to those procedures under the ROP. Whereas under SALP, the regulator could only enforce regulatory requirements. So the other thing I'd just like to mention is that, you know, I get the sense, and this is based on my experience at the NRC, as well as my observations and kind of perspective since I left, that the NRC staff almost feels this pressure to have perfect knowledge of anything and everything that might go wrong with the next generation of nuclear power. And, you know, it's an unreasonable burden for the staff to shoulder, because nuclear energy is like any other form of energy or industry. It does involve some risks. The risks are far, far lower than fossil sources of energy in terms of public health, human health, and the impact to the environment. But there are lots of tools in the NRC's toolkit for addressing things that we learn as they emerge. For example, we have the ability to issue orders, or talking like I'm still with the NRC. The NRC has that capability. The NRC has the ability to impose regulatory requirements or backfits, issue enforcement actions, not everything has to be solved at licensing, and yet I feel that the NRC staff thinks that it does need to solve everything at licensing. And the truth is, we have a lot of regulatory programs and latitude to address new learnings as they emerge when these plants are commissioned and deployed. And I think that too many NRC, even in people in leadership, lose sight of that. Not everyone in the staff has had the breadth and depth of experience to recognize that there are lots of ways to proverbially skin the cat when you encounter performance issues that cause public health and safety concerns. Not everything needs to be solved at licensing.
Pat, I noticed Sven has another question too that I think may carry on for you, Rani, there, that he just added.
Yeah. He asked, has any new reactor committed to following 10 CFR 53 over 10 CFR 50, and is 10 CFR 52 basically being abandoned?
I appreciate that question, Sven. Apparently, the Nuclear Energy Institute and U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, US NIC, conducted a survey on the Part 53 as it existed before Framework B was introduced. And according to the survey of, I believe it was 22 developers, applicants, and other industry representatives, only about 24% or 25%, as I recall, expressed an interest in using Part 53. The majority said that they didn't see how it would benefit them, or they just would not use it. They would use either 50 or 52. So the interesting thing is there's been a lot of hard work by the NRC staff and a lot of effort to put Part 53 together. But it borrows largely from existing frameworks under Part 50 and 52 that are already available to applicants. And so my perception, based on my own communications with industry representatives and what I learned from the survey results, is they don't see the utility of Part 53 if they can essentially use the existing frameworks to achieve the same kind of outcome without the additional regulatory requirements associated with qualitative health objectives, ALARA, and other operational programs that the NRC is signaling it would like to codify under Part 53. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that did, Rani. Thank you. Let's see, I just wanted to cover very briefly, because we do have a couple of minutes, a question that was asked about why is Part 53 not performance-based? And I'd like to go back to the Commission's definition of a performance-based approach in the SRM to SECI 98-144, which says that licensees should have flexibility to determine how to meet the established performance criteria in ways that will encourage and reward improved outcomes. And the next attribute is a framework exists in which the failure to meet a performance criterion, while undesirable, will not in and of itself constitute or result in an immediate safety concern. Now, I would offer that, as Rani has pointed out, the reactor oversight process has a framework that meets these attributes, and that is what makes it performance-based, whereas the staff has not offered up any such framework to tie together all the elements of Part 53. Rani, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that's a thought I wanted to bring out there. So.
Thanks, Prasad. And I did touch on this. I'm just trying to find which slide I covered it, but I also quoted from that SECI paper in the SRM that is an example of why it's not performance-based, because it does not provide those incentives for applicants to achieve higher or better safety outcomes. So I'm looking through my talking points here. I'm not seeing it, but I did touch on that as an example of why Part 53 in its current form is not performance-based. It doesn't incentivize or reward improved safety outcomes.
Yeah, you did touch on it, Rani. I was just elaborating on that thought, quoting directly from the SRM. So, so I was just trying to amplify what you said. So
I appreciate that, Prasad. I have no disagreement.
Okay. Anyway, I think you know, as always, we've come to the end of another community of practice session, and I hope everyone has enjoyed it and has benefited from it. And please propose ideas for future communities of practice sessions. I would really welcome new ideas. So thank you all very much. Pat, I think at this point, we can call a close to this session.
If I could just real quick offer my appreciation for the opportunity again to speak. And it's been a great, I think, opportunity for me to get some feedback on my thoughts from the audience. And I really appreciate their questions and their thoughtful consideration of what Breakthrough Institute is proposing. So just thank you all for being here and for your questions and your comments.
Thank you all. I'll call it a close.
Bye, everybody.